The lion's roar is the loudest of any cat. A lion's roar can be heard 5 miles away, and it unsettles everything within its path. Now, the early Christians might have been illiterate. They were not dumb. And they depicted the gospel stories and the gospels themselves with icons and with images. And even though the Gospel of Mark opens quite simply with the phrase, "the good news of Jesus Christ," it roars because Jesus' life unsettles everything in the first century. The abrupt and insistent messages of the gospel sent the good news far beyond the confines of the small area traversed by Jesus. And so that's why the Gospel of Mark is considered a lion. It inspired people to dismantle the Roman Empire and build a faith that crossed nationalities and eras. For the next 2 months, in fact, through the end of this liturgical calendar year, we're going to continue to hear the stories from the Gospel of Mark. Time has not dulled the story's sharp edges, nor Jesus' words of grace. And these stories are going to provoke us to wonder what his good news calls us to do now. So get used to seeing this guy. It's actually a stylized image contemporary of what would have been from the very early millennia of when the early Christians decided that this is a gospel that reminds them of a lion. And then next year, when we're in the Gospel of Luke, we can talk about why that is an ox. Before we get started, though, a few textual notes about Mark in general and this story in particular. When I took an entry-level New Testament class at the University of Chicago, you'd think that it would have had a prerequisite Greek proficiency exam or maybe Hebrew Bible competency. But to study the Gospels requires knowledge of geography first and foremost. So I remember vividly sitting at the kitchen counter flipping through old-fashioned flashcards as I tried to commit to memory on a map cities and rivers and places and towns and nationalities and people. And then in class, we read the Gospel of Mark alongside a map, noting the places that Jesus travels, the people he meets, and the numbers of people that he serves. Because Mark's Gospel is really thin, but Mark layers real meaning into those stories by a simple word of a town or a people. By the time you get to the end of the Gospel of Mark, you've got your map, you can see that Jesus has literally zigzagged across the Sea of Galilee and ventured into lands far from Nazareth and Capernaum to literally knit together a new body of people as his followers. Now, today's particular story follows a blow-up between Jesus and the Jewish leaders about holiness rituals. In a short summary, Jesus confounds them by saying that it's not what they consume that keeps them holy, it's what they do. It's what they do that creates goodness. And as if to demonstrate the answer, Jesus turns and heads deep into Gentile territory. Before I read the story, please pray with me. Dear God, with all the arguments and debates about what's good for us and who we should listen to, we come to hear your story of good news. God, silence all the noise that distracts us and startle us with your Son's truth, that we become faithful to him and him alone, and that we become his good news. We offer this prayer in the name of the risen Christ. Amen. I invite you to listen for God's living word as I read from the 7th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know that he was there, yet Jesus could not escape notice. And a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And Jesus said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat children's crumbs." And then he said to her, "For saying that you may go, and the demon has left your daughter." When she went home, she found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone. And then Jesus returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee to the region of the Decapolis. And there they brought him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hands on him. Jesus took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers in his ears and spat and touched his tongue. And then looking up to heaven, Jesus sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And the man's ears were opened and his tongue was released and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astounded beyond all measure, saying, "Jesus has done everything well, and he makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let's go back to the first story. You heard it. Jesus calls them dogs. He refers to a desperate mother and her suffering child as dogs. And there is no amount of twisting in the ways in which you try to translate the original Greek. There's no amount of twisting that can soften that original slur. And in the first century, dogs were not pets. They were mangy scavengers and strays, unwelcome. Now, the Syrophoenicians are of Canaanite origin, and this ethnic group of people were considered enemies to the Jews and eternal outsiders to the faith of Israel. And to make it even worse, this is a Syrophoenician woman. A woman accosts him. And regardless of her ethnic or religious identity in that era, it is never appropriate for a woman to demand anything from any man. So Jesus just ignores her. Insistent, she throws herself down before him, pleading a second time. And Jesus attempts to shut her down by saying, "You don't give the children's foods," meaning what he plans to give to the children of Israel. "I'm not going to give you, you dog, what I came for them." He rejects her, implying that his grace is for a select few. Now, is this a knee-jerk reaction to fall back on playground-like taunts he might have heard in his youth? Again, to be clear, you heard the story. He's not testing her faith. In fact, if anything, his curtness might just be because he wants to only be alone. We, listening to this story, we expect Jesus to offer his customary empathy and a miracle. And instead, he behaves as if he's above this, what he would call a Canaanite mongrel. But the woman persists. Even dogs get crumbs. Even dogs get crumbs, and she dismisses all ethnic and religious divides. So it's just the two of them. We can imagine the pin-drop silence as these two are alone. And the mother's gaze, once previously at his feet, she now looks directly at his eyes. Even dogs get crumbs, and am I less than a dog to you? Like any parent with a critically ill child, she persists, "Heal my daughter." Now, is this really the kind of story to bring to Celebration Sunday when we gather with full choir and brass to praise Jesus? Seriously, what kind of good news is this? I'm sure others would have preferred, maybe even me, to go to some other lectionary reading that describes faith as just a comforting balm. But the only reason our faith matters, and the only reason this church matters, is because the good news shapes us with a truth to withstand anything and everyone in life that is dangerous, whether it's a person, an idea, a belief, an illness. Our faith shapes us to withstand that, the division, and anything that's uncomfortable. Because outside of these sanctuary walls, today's rhetoric of despair and fear And all of the attempts to divide neighbor from neighbor and belittle an outsider or label a human being as unworthy, all of that we need to remember flies in the face of the good news of the gospel. All of that flies in the face of what we know to be true about God's love. Because comfort, true peace, comes from trusting in God, the one who creates, sustains, and redeems all of creation in this mystery of love. The good news of Jesus Christ is good news because primarily it opens us to the possibilities in our lives, particularly when it's uncomfortable, and we learn to turn in our lives always to trust in God. So let's unpack the story. Some theorize that Jesus antagonizes her with a slur to demonstrate long-standing racism. This is one school of thought, and let's go down the rabbit hole. He brings it to center stage precisely to overturn such prejudices for his followers back then and to teach us to do the same today. So let's imagine in this idea that Jesus, perhaps with a satirical gleam in his eye and a provocative tone of voice, says, "Oh, isn't it true that we shouldn't give the children's food to dogs? Isn't that what everyone says? What do you say?" The woman takes the bait and turns the metaphor on its head, and she proclaims God's grace is for all people right then and there. Jesus immediately concedes. My personal read is that's a stretch. It's a stretch for the way the Gospel of Mark portrays Jesus. So let's look at another way. Another way to interpret this story is that Jesus was bound by the conventional and divisive attitudes of his day. I mean, he was a Jew raised in Galilee. According to this approach, Jesus does change his mind. This foreign woman forces him to change his mind about her and his mission. And one could argue that this fits in the Old Testament tradition of the instances that God changes God's own mind in the face of arguments from Abraham and Hagar and Moses. Like those faith exemplars, this Syrophoenician woman takes her place in the ancient lineage of those who struggle with God, and she argues from the point of love. This is one reading, and it might actually work in that way because this is truly the only verbal fencing match in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus doesn't win. This approach demonstrates that everything, including Jesus, is to learn and evolve in the face of love. It might work for some, but I will tell you I have many colleagues that find that abhorrent. One actually said she would throw down her liturgical collar, that she just could not stand the idea that as a woman of faith that Jesus would ever be portrayed as a racist or a sexist. So what do you think? In our Reformed tradition, it's not about what I think or what scholars think, but it's about what does the Spirit inspire us as a body of believers to now know about the good news today, and what does the Spirit inspire us to do in bringing the good news? Perhaps the writer of Mark leaves this story so raw to prod us to wrestle with it centuries later and not bury it in favor of simple platitudes. Maybe this story is to read us. Perhaps that's the genius of Mark's gospel. The writer lets us squirm. Maybe this gospel writer shows us the danger of knee-jerk reactions. Maybe the gospel writer pleads for this good news to break apart any barriers that can confine us. Because just like back then is the same true today when we get so caught up in our notions of who is right, who's saved, who's not worthy. It takes the persistence of a beloved child of God to open our hearts and change our minds. And if we just stand around debating whether or not Jesus changes his mind, that merely becomes a delay mechanism. It becomes a delay mechanism if we choose to do that because we might not see ourselves in this story as Jesus's body today because we are his body, as the body of Christ, the church. And we, as Jesus' body today, must be willing to hear the pleas of those who might be called dogs in private, and instead see them as God's beloved. We don't like to change our minds. We don't like to change our minds. It requires such vulnerability. People who change their minds undergo the peculiar suffering of admitting to themselves that they were wrong. They swallow their pride, or they perhaps risk being cast out of a comfortable enclave that doesn't want them to change their minds. And yet, people who can change their minds are people who are under no illusion of being perfect. They know they're not perfect. They're humble, and they're vulnerable. And they know what it's like to receive and then extend mercy. And for Jesus, that's the bottom line. Here's another way to accept the story, because we don't get to snip it out of the gospel. It doesn't matter what was in the mind of Christ. It doesn't even matter what's in our own mind. What matters is what we do. And regardless of why, or Jesus' tone of voice or his intent, this story marks the crucial point in the good news when Jesus heals those long denied. He purposely went out of his way. He heals now a woman's daughter, and then after that, he heals a man who can now hear and speak and proclaim the good news. And we see in all these stories stacked up that when Jesus heals, yes, he's healing an individual person one at a time. And when he heals one person, what he's also doing is healing a fractured community, because the grace that comes to one person comes for the benefit of us all. Now, one of the most alarming things about Jesus is that he's not going to be contained, not like a lion's roar. He's not going to be contained to the first century, nor by the prejudices of his own time or even his own mind. He's not contained by the grave or our assumptions, and certainly not by the confines of our minds. We've got to be willing to let go of our small-minded thinking, and we, as his body today, must be willing to cross divides. And we, as his body today, must be uncomfortable with the pursuit of creating lasting change. So who is your Syrophoenician woman? Who is it that's coming to you pleading? Is it a mother pleading with us to do what is necessary to stop spiraling gun violence? Is it a migrant who's crossing rivers, and we finally open our eyes to see this as a human being, a beloved child of God? And yes, we've got a lot of things to do, but first and foremost, we see them as a beloved human. And let's add to that list those in need of medical care, food, access to mental health. We know of the ways in which God's children need our help. Or let's flip the coin. How are you a Syrophoenician woman? Who are you pleading to be healed? These are all the issues that grieve God's heart today. Receptivity to all of God's children, a willingness to consider new ideas and to change our minds requires us to leave behind old comforts, because only then do we become the agents for the good news to continue to expand beyond time and place. Today is Celebration Sunday. Today calls us to celebrate the good news. So let's let the good news disrupt our comfort. Let the good news open us to be healed of whatever keeps us from fully participating in this community as God creates us to be. Let this good news compel us to embrace another person through listening and speaking with those outside of our comfort zone. Will this be our crisis of faith? Only for those of us who choose to remain paralyzed by the grace of it all. Because, my friends, there is good news out there. There's good news for us to embody. May it be so.